My entitled neighbor stole my gas for her lavish parties. I had a plan to shut her down, but she kept coming back, until one night, it all blew up. A pungent, metallic aroma, far too sharp to be my own, assaulted Chris's senses. Before he even stepped from his truck, he stood frozen in his driveway, inhaling the unwelcome scent, until a faint, almost delicate hiss drew his attention to the shared fence line with his neighbor Brenda. Brenda, the self-proclaimed monarch of their homeowners association, the neighborhood's self-appointed moral compass. Her house, usually an emblem of pristine order, was a carnival of streamers and scattered folding chairs, the soft clink of wine glasses drifting through the crisp morning air. It was a Saturday, 10 a.m., and Brenda was already hosting what could only be described as a pre-party for a pre-party. Chris, a man who believed in a methodical approach to life's mysteries, followed the sound like a bloodhound on a scent. There it was, a garish, bright orange rubber hose, brazenly snaking from his gas meter, under the fence, and directly into Brenda's lavish backyard. He knelt, his fingers tracing the illicit connection, feeling the warm thrum of his stolen utilities. It was like finding a siphon tube shoved into your car's gas tank, in broad daylight. What audacity! Chris actually chuckled, a dry, incredulous sound, not from humor, but from the sheer, unadulterated nerve of it all. She hadn't even attempted a disguise. No trench, no landscaping camouflage, just a blatant, "Hey world, I'm stealing this gas" statement. From Brenda's side of the fence, her booming voice sliced through the jazz music, directing someone on the precise placement of an ice sculpture, which from the sounds was a grand swan. The faint scent of propane burners mingling with the catering made Chris pause. Propane? Why would someone with a wealth of propane need his natural gas? Then it hit him with a jolt. She wasn't merely pilfering for cooking. Brenda was powering the colossal heaters for her sprawling white party tent, now visible, peeking over the fence like a smug, bloated cloud. Chris retreated to his driveway, pulled out his phone, and dialed the gas company. He aimed for a low-drama solution, at least for now, hoping a professional shutdown would suffice. They delivered the standard "someone will be there within 2 hours." Chris hung up, resuming his morning routine, feigning nonchalance. But inside, a strategic game was already unfolding. Chris was a man who played the long game. A direct confrontation, that would only fuel Brenda's insufferable martyr complex. No, this required something surgical, subtle, and infinitely more gratifying. The first volley arrived by noon, an official-looking envelope, emblazoned with the HOA logo, taped to his front door. Brenda had actually typed out an accusation. He, Chris, had interfered with community utilities and created a hazard by tampering with his own gas line. The sheer mental gymnastics were almost admirable. She was already twisting the narrative, painting him as the neighborhood villain, preemptively casting herself as the wronged victim. That evening, Chris became a diligent evidence collector. He positioned his phone camera through a gap in the fence, capturing the bright orange hose trailing from his meter into her yard. He zoomed in, documenting the splitter, feeding multiple lines beneath her opulent tent. Brenda's voice, loud, brash, and blissfully oblivious, echoed in the background. "Don't worry about those skyrocketing gas bills," she chirped to someone. "I've got a special hookup." Her laugh, a self-satisfied cackle, would be pure gold later. Early the next morning, the gas company technician arrived. One look at the setup, and he let out a low whistle, immediately snapping his own photos. He confirmed it wasn't just theft. It was a grave danger. He disconnected the hose, securing Chris's meter with a locking cap. The moment Brenda's heaters went cold, she stormed out, marching directly to the fence. Spotting Chris, she launched into a furious tirade about community cooperation and sharing resources. Chris, with a calm he didn't quite feel, inquired if that extended to him using her water spigot whenever he pleased. She sputtered something about selfishness, then stomped back inside. Later that week, The HOA meeting commenced. Brenda naturally was holding court, performing for the board members as if testifying before Congress. She ranted about Chris sabotaging her event, ruining the ambiance, and then unbelievably, tried to push through a new utility sharing clause in the HOA bylaw. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Chris, observing from the back, let her dig her own hole. When she finally, with a flourish, asked if anyone had anything to add, Chris rose, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I do," he stated simply. He pulled out his phone, hit play, and Brenda's self-incriminating special hookup speech filled the room. The silence was absolute. Delicious. You could practically see the exact moment the board members grasped her blatant deception. A few stifled laughs. Brenda's face flushed to the color of an overripe tomato. She stammered about context and jokes, but the damage was done. Yet Chris knew Brenda. This wasn't over. She wouldn't retreat. She'd regroup. And that, he realized, was exactly what he was counting on. Just 2 days later, the first signs of her next scheme appeared. Large delivery trucks, laden with crates of party supplies, string lights, enormous kegs, colossal speakers, catering equipment, began arriving at Brenda's residence. She was planning something monumental, something she couldn't possibly finance on her own. Chris could almost hear the gears grinding in her entitled mind, concocting a way around the locking cap on his meter. This wasn't another backyard tent party. This was an escalation. If his hunch was right, she was about to spectacularly overplay her hand. That evening, sitting on his porch, watching the glow from Brenda's house shimmer against the twilight sky, Chris had an epiphany. He didn't need to catch her in the act again. He had a better idea, one that would not only stop her, but make her think twice before ever crossing him again. It needed to be loud, legal, and so undeniably public that she'd have no escape. As fate would have it, the perfect opportunity was just around the corner. By the following weekend, Brenda's yard had transformed into the staging ground for a small music festival. The previous white tent was replaced by a colossal structure, easily mistaken for a wedding venue. Globe lights crisscrossed the air, industrial heaters lined the perimeter like soldiers, and a full stage, complete with professional sound equipment, stood against the back fence. Chris watched a man in a black polo testing microphones, another wheeling in kegs the size of oil drums. This wasn't merely a neighborhood gathering. It was a full-blown production. Chris had done his homework. Brenda's social media posts, ostensibly private but always finding their way to community gossip channels, hinted at a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. Her guest list extended beyond locals, including friends, family, and special guests from out of town. She'd even tagged a semi-famous cover band. The most revealing clue, though, came from an overheard conversation in the grocery store parking lot. Brenda, speaking to one of her HOA cronies, casually remarked, "Don't worry about the heating bill. I've got that handled." That phrase, "got that handled," was her tell. It signaled she'd already crossed a line and was smugly proud of it. The locking cap on his gas meter wouldn't deter her. Chris suspected she'd find a way to bypass it, perhaps even hire someone shady to re-establish her special hookup. So Chris called his friend, a county fire inspector. He recounted the entire saga, showed him the video, and expressed his strong suspicion that Brenda was about to create another dangerously illegal setup. The inspector's eyebrow arched. "If she does," he stated firmly, giving Chris his personal number, "you call me directly." He also reminded Chris that tampering with a natural gas line wasn't just theft. It was a criminal offense punishable by court. Sure enough, Friday night, Chris caught her in the act. He'd installed a small motion-activated camera, angled perfectly to view the meter. At 10:30 p.m., his phone pinged. There she was, Brenda, in a puffy vest and headlamp, crouched by the meter with an unfamiliar man, carrying a toolkit. The locking cap was still in place, but within minutes, it was off, and another bright orange hose was being attached. Brenda's voice, hushed but discernible, whispered, "Once this is hooked up, We're set for the weekend. Chris didn't intervene, not yet. He silently recorded every hiss and click of their illicit work. They ran the hose under the fence and vanished into her yard. He let them believe they'd succeeded, for the trap needed to be perfectly baited before it could spring. Chris sent the video to his fire inspector friend with a terse message. She's live again. Party tomorrow. The response was immediate. We'll be there. The next morning, Chris began his part of the grand design. Brenda's core problem wasn't just her thievery. It was her insatiable need for control and perception. She had built her HOA power by appearing untouchable. Everyone knew she was trouble, yet few dared to challenge her directly, knowing she'd twist the narrative, making them seem petty or vindictive. This takedown had to be public, undeniable, and delivered squarely in front of her adoring audience. A private confrontation would simply offer her an escape route. By late afternoon, cars already lined the street. Guests, dressed in cocktail attire, streamed into Brenda's backyard, laughter and the clinking of wine bottles filling the air. The giant tent glowed from within, heaters blasting, the atmosphere shimmering with manufactured warmth. The scent of catered delicacies mingled with the faint, telltale hiss of gas. Chris watched Brenda at the entrance, greeting her guests with that syrupy sweet smile she reserved for moments when she was drunk on her own importance. He remained hidden, biding his time. His friend from the fire department arrived with 2 other inspectors, all in official uniform. They parked a block away, blending into the crowd to avoid tipping Brenda off. Chris met them near his driveway, and they quickly reviewed the plan. Step 1, confirm the illegal hookup. Step 2, immediate shutdown. Step 3, ensure Brenda's unsuspecting guests understood precisely why their precious party was being interrupted. They slipped along the side of Chris's property, toward the meter. The bright orange hose was instantly visible, and the inspectors followed its path directly under the fence. One inspector nodded, and they calmly stepped through Brenda's open gate. No knock necessary. Barely 6 seconds passed before Brenda's sharp, incredulous voice pierced the air. What do you think you're doing? The inspectors introduced themselves, explaining they'd received a report of a dangerous gas setup. They didn't need to search. The brazen hose was in plain view, feeding into a metal manifold and then into 4 separate lines leading to the heaters. When they calmly stated they were shutting it off immediately, Brenda erupted. Her voice, amplified by rage, cut through the party music, drawing every eye. This is harassment, she shrieked. I have a right to keep my guests warm. She then had the audacity to argue that the gas was shared community property, and she was entitled to use it as she saw fit. An inspector with icy calm retorted, "Ma'am, this is theft and a safety hazard. If you wish to dispute it, we can involve the police right now." That was Chris's cue. He stepped into view leaning against the fence, arms crossed, a slow, deeply satisfied smile gracing his lips. The guests were now rapt, whispering, some already filming. The inspector turned the valve. The heaters exhaled a collective sigh and went cold. The sudden chill in the tent was a symbolic slap. Brenda's eyes darted frantically as her perfect evening unraveled before her VIP audience. Then came the ultimate humiliation. His friend pulled out a clipboard, presenting Brenda with a written citation. The fines listed made her gasp audibly. "This is outrageous," she screeched. "You can't do this in front of my guests." The inspector's reply was delivered with perfect deadpan timing. "Ma'am, you did this in front of your guests." A ripple of chuckles spread through the crowd. A few people openly laughed. Someone muttered, "Guess that explains the free heat." Brenda tried to rally, babbling about a misunderstanding and licensed professionals who'd assured her it was fine. The handyman from the night before was conspicuously absent, clearly smart enough to flee. The inspectors, unfazed by her theatrics, packed their gear, leaving the tent bathed only in the dim glow of decorative string lights. The temperature plummeted, and the festive atmosphere curdled into awkward silence. Guests began making their excuses to leave. Chris remained just long enough to watch her elaborate event deflate like a pricked balloon. But he knew Brenda. This wasn't the end. Humiliated before an audience she desperately wanted to impress, She wouldn't take it lying down. She'd plot something larger, more vindictive, and undoubtedly dumber, and Chris was ready to light things up. Literally, when the next moment came, it would make tonight's public humiliation seem like a mere inconvenience. By Monday morning, Brenda's party meltdown was the neighborhood's hottest gossip. It spread like wildfire, embellished and distorted into a dozen soap opera plots. Some claimed she'd wept before the inspectors, others that she'd hurled a wine bottle at one. A lie Chris didn't bother to correct. What mattered was the indelible image, now seared into everyone's minds. Brenda, HOA queen, standing in her freezing tent, guests scurrying out, muttering about illegal gas hookups. It was precisely the public dent in her reputation Chris had aimed for. Yet, as satisfying as it was, Chris knew retaliation was Brenda's next move. Her ego simply wouldn't allow her to let it slide. True to form, by Tuesday evening, an official-looking letter on HOA letterhead was stuffed into his mailbox. It accused him of sabotage, willful negligence of community harmony, and malicious interference. She even claimed his actions caused her irreparable emotional distress, and that she was reviewing legal options. Chris read it twice, laughed once, and filed it under exhibit. What Brenda didn't realize was that Chris had already begun laying the groundwork for his next decisive step. His father, a retired fire marshal, had ingrained in him the critical importance of documentation in disputes like this. Every letter, every overheard comment, every photograph, was a crucial piece of a larger puzzle, and the puzzle Chris was assembling wasn't merely about winning against Brenda. It was about ensuring she could never again pull such stunts without facing undeniable consequence. He initiated reconnaissance. 2 younger neighbors, college kids with drones, were thrilled to conduct test flights over Brenda's backyard. The footage was damning. Propane tanks stored dangerously close to the tent walls, multiple extension cords snaking through wet grass, and most tellingly, a fresh trench near her fence line. Narrow but deep, it appeared to originate near her garage and run directly toward Chris's buried gas line. Ethan's drone also captured Brenda meeting with the same handyman from the night she'd tampered with Chris's meter. They pointed into the trench, Brenda's animated, bossy gestures leaving no doubt she was directing the work. This wasn't a mere rebound party. This was preparation for something far grander and far more dangerous. Chris decided to preempt her. That night he called his fire inspector friend again. "If she's trying to tap into your gas line underground," his friend sighed, "that's even more dangerous. That's not just theft. That's a potential explosion hazard." He offered a profound piece of advice that resonated deeply with Chris. "You can't stop her from being stupid, but you can control when and how that stupidity blows up in her face." That phrase, when and how, ignited Chris's ultimate plan. He didn't just want to catch her. He wanted to orchestrate the scene so perfectly that her scheme's unraveling would be cinematic, and he knew exactly when that moment would arrive. The 4th of July weekend. Their neighborhood hosted a massive block party every year, and Brenda had already appointed herself coordinator. It meant she'd have the perfect cover for massive electricity and heating demands, at least in her own deluded mind. But if she planned to fuel her party with Chris's gas again, he could use that against her in spectacular fashion. Over the next 2 weeks, Chris maintained a facade of calm. He didn't confront her about the trench, nor did he obstruct her digging. In fact, he allowed her to believe she was operating completely under his radar. Meanwhile, he hired a licensed plumber to install a hidden secondary shutoff valve for his gas line, buried discreetly under a locked steel cover in his yard. They routed a bypass line that vented harmlessly outside, ensuring any unauthorized flow would simply dissipate into the open air. In essence, if Brenda tapped in, she'd get nothing, but Chris could also control precisely when the flow resumed, and that, he knew, was where the real fun would begin. The day before the block party, his suspicions were confirmed. The trench was filled, the grass tamped down, and a brand new, ornamental flower bed sat atop it, like a ridiculously bad disguise. His gas meter readings showed an inexplicable spike. Brenda had made her connection. She believed she was fueling her party on his dime, utterly unaware that he held the power to turn off her supply at will. On the morning of the 4th, The street was alive with anticipation. Flags and bunting adorned porches. Children zipped by on bikes with streamers. And the tantalizing scent of barbecue wafted from every yard. Brenda's setup, predictably, was over the top. A massive outdoor buffet, an open bar, a rented dance floor, and a stage replete with a full band's worth of equipment. Dressed as if she were hosting a televised gala, she glided through her yard, champagne glass in hand. Well before noon, she spotted Chris once, offered a tight, smug smile, and vanished into her tent. Chris waited until just after sunset. The band was in full swing. The heaters roared, and the tent glowed like a beacon of stolen warmth. People laughed, glasses clinked, and the air was thick with the aroma of grilled food. That was his cue. He quietly turned the secondary shut-off valve. Within minutes, the heaters sputtered, then died, plunging the tent into a sudden chill. A confused murmur rippled through Brenda's guest. Brenda herself strode out, frantic, searching for a culprit. That's when Chris reopened the valve. But only for a moment. He let the heaters roar back to life, just long enough for Brenda to relax, then shut them off again. He repeated the cycle twice, each time watching her grow more flustered, barking at her staff, glaring suspiciously at the equipment. On the third cycle, he left it off completely. She stormed towards her garage, likely to check the connection, but Chris knew she'd find nothing amiss. And that again was his signal. He discreetly tipped off his fire inspector friend, reporting irregularities at Brenda's party once more. This time, the inspector arrived with a small crew and 2 off-duty cops, who happened to be neighbors invited to the block party. They walked directly into Brenda's tent, interrupting the band mid-song, and announced they were shutting down an unsafe fuel source. The timing was impeccable. The music died. The heaters went dark for the final time. The crowd's murmurs swelled into open curiosity. Phones emerged, recording. Someone even let out a cheer. Brenda tried to bluff, insisting her setup was certified and HOA approved, but an inspector calmly pulled a panel off a heater, exposing the hidden hose snaking into the ground. A hose that led directly to the trench in her yard and to Chris's gas line. The police didn't arrest her on the spot, but they didn't have to. They issued a formal violation, and the inspectors made her disconnect everything before they left. Her guests began filing out, some openly mocking her now. The neighborhood's planned fireworks show ignited in the distance, just as Brenda stood alone in her dark, cold tent, champagne glass unsipped for over an hour. The timing was poetic. Everyone else gazed up at the sky, illuminated by explosions of light, while she stood fuming. If Chris had learned anything about people like Brenda, it was that humiliation rarely taught humility. It merely compelled them to invent more creative forms of spite. By the Monday following the block party, she was back on the offense. Chris awoke to 3 more HOA violation notices taped to his front door, all signed by her. One accused him of unsightly landscaping due to a patch of summer-browned lawn. Another claimed his driveway had oil stains detrimental to community aesthetic. The last, laughably, simply read, excessive noise during nighttime hours. Despite Chris being in bed by 10 most nights, she was attempting to bury him in petty citations, the kind that required endless time and paperwork to resolve. Chris ignored every single one. The more he ignored her bait, the more frustrated she'd become, and the more likely she'd be to make a truly colossal mistake. He could already sense it brewing. Midweek he spotted her in her backyard, conversing with a man in a gray jumpsuit emblazoned with Metro Fuel Service. The man held a clipboard in a tool bag, exuding the stiff posture of someone there for cash, not conversation. They stood by the ornamental flower bed, the one concealing the trench, gesturing towards the ground. Chris couldn't make out their words, but Brenda's animated arm movements suggested she wasn't simply ordering new landscaping. That evening, Ethan, his friendly drone pilot, delivered another video. The jumpsuit-clad man had returned after dark, hauling a heavy metal cylinder from his van into Brenda's garage. He stayed for about an hour before driving off. Chris's conclusion: Brenda had hired someone to either reroute her illegal hookup, or install a system that would make her even less reliant on paying her own fuel costs. This was no longer about throwing parties. It was about Brenda reasserting her sense of control over Chris. And then she handed him the perfect gift. Thursday afternoon, a personal letter arrived. Not on HOA letterhead this time. It was written in her signature passive-aggressive style, replete with legal-sounding gibberish, clearly pilfered from a Google search. She declared that, as per community resource sharing principles, a phrase she'd entirely invented, she possessed full legal rights to access surplus utilities, not being utilized by their assigned owner. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat. If you continue to impede my lawful access, I will escalate this matter to the highest authorities available to me. Chris had no idea what highest authorities Brenda believed were in her arsenal, but he knew for certain they wouldn't be the ones knocking on his door when this final act climaxed. In that moment, Chris decided the grand finale had to be undeniably loud, spectacularly visual, and so inextricably linked to her actions, that even Brenda couldn't spin it. He started making calls. First, to his fire inspector friend, who had already proven his competence and willingness to show up when things got interesting. Then to an old high school buddy, a field producer for the local news station, who relished a juicy human interest story, especially one involving neighborhood drama. Chris pitched it as a public safety exposé, with an irresistible visual hook. By the time he finished, his friend was grinning on the phone, promising to have a camera crew just happening to be nearby when Chris gave the signal. Next came the physical preparation. Chris had the plumber return to fine-tune his hidden secondary shutoff valve, rigging it with a small release pipe that vented harmlessly into the open air when turned. It wouldn't cause damage, merely a very obvious visual and auditory effect if Brenda tapped into it again. Safe, yes, but unmistakably dramatic. A loud hiss, a sudden whoosh, perhaps even a harmless puff of vapor for added theatricality. The 4th of July was long past, but Brenda had seized upon another excuse for a community celebration. The end of summer scheduled for late August. She'd plastered flyers throughout the neighborhood announcing live music, an open bar, free comfort heating, her bolded words, and courtesy of your HOA. She wasn't even attempting to conceal her plan to consume vast amounts of fuel. The morning of the event, Chris checked his meter readings. Just as he suspected, the numbers had spiked. She was hooked in again. He called his news friend, who confirmed his crew was on standby. Then he called his fire inspector friend, who promised to arrive about an hour into the party, just long enough for the place to be packed, and for the cameras to capture Brenda's shift from smug confidence to utter panic. By evening, Brenda's yard was wall-to-wall with people. The tent was back, heaters roaring, the bar fully stocked. Brenda was in her element, circulating with a glass of wine, that self-satisfied smile plastered on her face, as if she'd already won whatever invisible competition she was playing. Chris positioned himself on his porch, with a perfect line of sight to the flower bed. He waited for the inspector's text. When it came, it was curt. Ready. Chris gave the go-ahead, then twisted the valve. The effect was instantaneous. A deep resounding hiss erupted from the side of Brenda's yard, loud enough to cut through the music. Heads turned. A plume of vapor shot skyward from the vent pipe, catching the glow of the string lights like a ghostly geyser. People instinctively recoiled from the heaters, murmuring nervously. Within 30 seconds, Brenda's music abruptly ceased, and she rushed towards the source of the commotion, a look of bewildered fury contorting her face. That's when the inspectors arrived, right on cue, with Chris's news buddy's camera crew in tow. They wasted no time. They walked directly into her yard, announced they were shutting down an illegal fuel connection, and ordered everyone to clear the immediate area. The cameras captured every second. Brenda arguing, flailing her arms, desperately trying to block the inspectors from reaching the hose buried in the ground. The crew filmed, as an inspector followed the hose directly to her flower bed, pulled it up, and exposed the illicit connection to Chris's gas line. Brenda's guests stood frozen, some recording on their phones, others openly whispering. She did it again. The fire inspector turned to the camera, explaining in stark, damning terms how dangerous and illegal Brenda's setup was. He didn't need to embellish. The scene spoke volumes. The hidden hose, the hiss of venting gas, the cluster of heaters now cold and useless.
Brenda's voice cracked as she tried to claim she had written permission from Chris. From his porch, Chris let out an audible laugh, which the cameras caught. "You have permission?" the inspector asked, eyebrows raised. "Absolutely," she insisted, her voice shrill. He pointed to Chris. "Do you confirm that, sir?" Chris slowly shook his head. "Not unless you count permission to embarrass yourself in front of the entire neighborhood," he replied, his voice calm and clear. The look on Brenda's face in that moment could have powered the entire block. The inspectors issued a second violation, and a uniformed police officer, now officially on duty, handed her a notice to appear in court for theft of utilities and reckless endangerment. The news crew captured it all. Brenda tried to storm inside, slamming the door, but not before the camera caught a close-up of her face, crimson with rage and utter humiliation.
The court date arrived faster than Chris expected, likely because the city wanted to make an example of someone who could turn a utility theft case into a recurring public safety hazard. Brenda attempted to delay, filing nonsensical motions about schedule conflicts and pending settlement discussions, but the judge summarily rejected them. Chris doubted the judge appreciated being legally instructed to rearrange his calendar for a backyard socialite. The morning of the hearing, Chris walked into the county courthouse, a folder so thick it resembled a legal textbook. Inside were copies of every vitriolic letter Brenda had sent, every fabricated HOA violation, drone footage of her trench, screenshots of her social media posts, bragging about free heating, and the crown jewels videos from all 3 gas theft incidents. His fire inspector friend was there in uniform, alongside Ethan, armed with a flash drive of aerial shots. Even his news buddy offered to testify about what he'd witnessed. Brenda arrived late, draped in oversized sunglasses and a beige suit, clearly attempting to project an image of serious professionalism. Her attorney, a younger man, looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The instant she spotted Chris, she lifted her chin, treating him like a complete stranger, and marched into the courtroom without a single glance. The case itself concluded surprisingly swiftly. The prosecutor began with Chris's fence camera footage, showing Brenda and her mystery handyman brazenly removing the locking cap and attaching the hose. Brenda's lawyer objected, muttering about unlawful surveillance, but the judge waved it off. Then came the drone footage of the trench, still images of the hose snaking into her flower bed, and the inspector's own damning photos of the illegal connections. With each piece of evidence displayed, Brenda squirmed in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, as if trying to shake off an invisible heat. But the moment that truly broke her came when the prosecutor played the news clip. The courtroom speakers filled with the unmistakable hiss of venting gas. The camera zooming in on Brenda, her face flushed crimson, as the inspector calmly explained to the reporter that this was the 3rd known incident of unauthorized fuel tapping. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Brenda's defense was as flimsy as Chris anticipated. Her lawyer argued she'd been misled by contractors who assured her the setup was legal. She claimed she believed the gas line extended into community property, and therefore wasn't solely Chris's. At one point she even attempted to suggest Chris had given her verbal permission, in the spirit of community harmony, which elicited an audible laugh from someone in the gallery. When it was Chris's turn to speak, he kept his words concise and his demeanor calm. He recounted the entire history, how he discovered the first hookup, how Brenda defiantly doubled down after being warned, and how the danger to her guests and neighbors escalated with each successive incident. He didn't raise his voice, didn't embellish, simply laid out the unvarnished facts and allowed the irrefutable evidence to do the talking. When he finished, he felt the palpable shift in the room. This was no longer a petty neighbor squabble. It was about an individual who had repeatedly endangered others because she believed rules didn't apply to her. The judge's decision was swift. Brenda was heavily fined for theft of utilities, ordered to pay restitution for the gas she'd stolen, and required to cover the cost of all inspections. More importantly, she was banned from hosting any events requiring outdoor heating or fuel-powered appliances for the next 2 years without prior inspection and explicit approval from the city. And for good measure, the HOA bylaws were updated at the city's recommendation, stripping Brenda of any unilateral decision-making power over community resource management. The look on her face as the gavel struck down was almost worth the months of hassle. She departed the courtroom without a word, but her attorney shot Chris a look that eloquently conveyed, "You're never getting invited to their Christmas party." You might think that would be the end. In most neighborhoods, it would have been. But Brenda's pride, a stubborn, unyielding force, refused to be silenced. It merely sought new outlets for its defiance. Over the next few weeks, Chris noticed small, petty acts of rebellion. She'd park her SUV, subtly blocking his driveway. Her sprinklers would accidentally overshoot onto his flower beds. She even had the nerve to glare at him during HOA meetings, as if he had personally orchestrated the dismantling of her entire social standing, which, to be fair, he had. The fascinating thing was, the rest of the neighborhood seemed to shift too. People who had once been too intimidated to speak against Brenda suddenly found their voices. At the very next HOA meeting, 2 members boldly called her out for mismanaging funds from the community beautification budget. Someone else revealed she'd been using HOA money to hire her own caterers for events. For the first time, Brenda didn't have the numbers on her side. By the end of that month, she resigned from her HOA position. She claimed it was to focus on personal matters, but everyone knew the truth. She had been dethroned. Stripped of the platform she used to control everyone, she became just another neighbor, albeit one with a criminal record and a reputation for being the most entitled person in 3 zip codes. The following summer, the annual block party felt fundamentally different. No over-the-top tents, no industrial heaters, no smug queen holding court at the entrance. People were genuinely relaxed, talking and laughing without the constant undercurrent of tension that had always followed Brenda. The irony was profound. For all her incessant talk about community harmony, it took her removal from power for true harmony to finally flourish. Chris kept his distance from her after that, not out of fear she'd lost all ability to harm him, but because there was nothing left to win. He had decisively beaten her at her own game, not by shouting or descending to her level, but by letting her own colossal ego do most of the work. All he had to do was meticulously document it, and wait for the perfect moment to make it public. Every now and then, though, he'd see her standing in her yard staring across at his property with that same tight, self-important smile she wore when she believed she was untouchable. He never waved, never spoke, simply continued with his day, knowing she'd forever remember the night her party ended in a hiss of vapor and the glow of camera lights. The night she became the cautionary tale whispered at every HOA meeting. And if he was being honest, on certain quiet evenings, when the air was still and the neighborhood calm, Chris would catch himself smiling too, because every time someone mentioned that story, every time a new neighbor asked, "Wait, is she the gas line lady?" it was another little firework igniting, long after the 4th of July had ended.